It's been a really long time, and the homework is overdue, so let's just jump straight into the main course. This video will contain spoilers from Season 2, Episodes 1 through 5. Foundations. Season 2 starts with the Matthews house crumbling down, and a busload of people arriving in the town, but for now, we'll just focus on the house. I found it a little bit interesting that many of the characters in the show were surprised that the house just crumbled, including Jim. However, we did learn that the foundation of the house was hollowed, and that underneath it were underground chambers where the monsters seemed to live and collect human objects, kinda like a dragon would. This almost immediately made me think of a passage from the Bible, which just so happens to be in a book named The Gospel of Matthew, and talks about how if a house is not built on a strong foundation, or on the rock, it will crumble and will be unable to weather a storm, which very much paralleled everything that happened to the Matthews house, from it crumbling to the storm that came before, and not coincidence if it is one. We can also see how the house tried to balance itself by filling the hole in the basement with a portion of the ceiling, leaving another hole in the upper floor. This could also be interpreted as a possible reference to the concept of as above, so below, or what happens on one level happens on another, quite literally in the case of the house, which also falls in line with our psychological interpretation of the show, noting how unconscious processes influence our conscious behavior and vice versa, and quite clearly seeing how the underground chambers where the monsters live are a good representation for the unconscious. Additionally, the concept of a strong foundation is also symbolically emphasized with the balancing puzzles that Tabitha started seeing and bumping into. We could even see this idea of balance and structure in the interpersonal relationships of the townspeople, and how the leadership, Boyd, Donna, and previously Father Catre, serve as foundational pillars that keep the town from falling apart. And the best way to compromise a structure is to attack its foundation. And with Father Catre down, we can see how the pressure is now being geared towards Boyd and Donna through different trials and tribulations.
I'm not sure how much more I can take.
The worm. Worms are symbols of transformation and also represent the cycle of life, turning decayed matter into fertile soil. It is then suiting that Martin's last words might have carried a possible biblical payload, "My blood is your blood now," which made me think of what Jesus said to his disciples, also in the Gospel of Matthew, where in the Last Supper, Jesus says, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Now, to better understand why the creators of the show might be using this level of biblical symbolism, we should also note that Martin is also the name of the patron saint of soldiers. Additionally, we should also remember that Boyd's nickname in the military was Mr. Fish and Loaves, making reference to the biblical story where Jesus gives fish and bread to a multitude. The latter drives home how the writers like to incorporate biblical symbolism into the show. Now, there is a strange thematic parallel between the biblical symbolism of sacrifice and the blood of Christ and the alchemical and Jungian interpretations of the worm that I can't quite fully put my finger on, so I'll try to tread carefully here. One should note that in alchemical tradition, you probably know this guy who was obsessed with it, the worm is also associated with the serpent or dragon, which is oftentimes depicted as a worm-like creature. These worms then serve as a symbol of physical and spiritual transformation, rebirth, purification, and the concept of the eternal return or cyclical nature of life, which we've discussed in previous videos. Even in Norse mythology, the world serpent or the serpent of Midgard is depicted as a worm-like creature. Some modern TV shows like Ragnarok have also used the worm to represent the serpent of Midgard. We can also find worms or worm-like creatures at the roots of the world tree in some modern artistic renditions. If you've watched Harry Potter, you've probably heard of the Philosopher's Stone. In alchemy, the Philosopher's Stone was meant to be a fabled substance that had the power to transform base metals into gold and produce the elixir of life, granting immortality. This process of transformation was meant to be both physical and spiritual, elevating consciousness to a higher level of enlightenment. Now, in alchemy, the transformation here from base metals to pure or precious metals is purely metaphorical. The transformation sought by the alchemist is both metaphysical and psychological, at least within consensus modern interpretation. In other words, the individual is transformed from their original base or flawed state to a higher and more enlightened version of themselves. This process of transformation starts with decomposition or breaking down of the source metal or individual, which metaphorically refers to the act of willingly entering a state of chaos, and re-examining one's life, beliefs, and behaviors, and then letting go of or deconstructing any aspects of ourselves that hold us back from our full potential to grow as individuals. I wonder if the latter might be one of the reasons why the show is named From. It is fair to say the creators of From are familiar with all these concepts, and I think it would then make sense to name the show this way to illustrate how the point of the story is how people can grow and change regardless of where they are starting from, while drawing upon the alchemical concept of transformation through chaos. Like Father Catras said,
"In our faith, we understand that chaos is the meaning. It is in our struggle, in our search, that we find our purpose."
Going back to the worms, in alchemy, the worms are then seen as a catalyst for this process of transformation or purification, partly due to their ability to break things down. Based on all of this, the worms in Boyd's arm might actually be a transformative and purifying force. I think that the symbol of the worm is juxtaposed by the blood of Christ in the biblical context. Jesus sharing the bread and wine as symbols of his body and blood represent the washing away or removal of people's sins. That is, the blood of Christ purifies via redemption and spiritual rebirth. On the other hand, the worms purify via destruction and psychological and physical rebirth. We also know that the concept of sin is also highlighted in episode 5, when Sara asks Elgin if he thinks that God truly forgives anything so long as you repent. The creators of From tend to be very eclectic when they mix, match, and implement all these complex concepts into the show. In the case of Boyd hosting the worms, I wonder if it will be the worms or the spider bites that end up curing his Parkinson's, as discussed in previous videos. The effect of the worms as symbols here are likely not only limited to physics, but also may act as a catalyst for something we've discussed in earlier videos, which is the process of individuation or self-realization, psychological growth, where we integrate or combine both the aspects of our unconscious self, the shadow or darkness, and our conscious self, the ego. The imagery of Martin being chained and in suffering, along with the symbolic meaning of the worms and Boyd's journey as a hero, also convey the theme of suffering as a transformative step towards individuation or enlightenment. This is probably a discussion as old as humanity itself. In line with the context of the present biblical symbolism, we can contemplate how the concept of suffering is depicted in the Bible through the crucifixion of Jesus, his death, the death of the ego, and his rebirth and transmutation into a higher being on the third day. In the Bible, Jesus will often tell his disciples how suffering is part of this world, while emphasizing the virtue of faith and perseverance in the face of suffering. It is through adversity and sacrifice that ultimate transformation and inner growth take place, and this town is clearly a catalyst for the latter. In other words, suffering itself is not a goal or virtue, but only the eternal cycle to which humanity is chained to. By facing suffering willingly, or taking on one's cross as Jesus will put it in the Bible, one can become liberated. Also in line with Buddhist teachings, some of the main causes of suffering are attachment, ignorance, and unwillingness to let go, which interestingly makes one think of something the characters of the show have been referencing since season 1, that they all need something to hold on to in the town, a memory, a semblance of their previous lives, to avoid losing themselves. But the contrary can happen if we hold on to something that is actually holding us back. In the case of the townspeople, their resistance to change and willful ignorance, that is, their avoidance of the unknown and reluctance to re-examine their beliefs and behavior, might be what's prolonging their suffering and leaving them stuck. It can be a tricky business to figure out what to let go of and what to hold on to during a process of transformation. But a potential good note for Kenny, maybe Christy really needs to or will eventually let go of her fiancé. Now, following up on our Jungian analysis series, we find the most interesting interpretation of the worm. Jung saw the worm as a symbol for the shadow, the dark part of ourselves, and the opposite of light or consciousness, which we've discussed in previous videos. But the shadow simply represents hidden, undesirable, and frightening aspects of ourselves, not just evil in a binary sense, but a much more nuanced and unremovable part of ourselves that must be understood and assimilated. When we say that the shadow must be integrated or assimilated, we mean that it must be confronted and acknowledged by our conscious selves, which is in line with the theme of overcoming fears we saw in episode 5. Once assimilated, which is a continuous process, then our conscious selves can begin to channel the shadow as a source of power to overcome challenges and unlock hidden qualities or potential. In June's Black Books, he writes, "I bring you the beauty of suffering. That is what is needed by whoever hosts the worm." And I find the language in this passage to beautifully fit the way the producers of From are illustrating Boyd's journey towards personal growth, the worms as symbols, and the meaning of suffering that is required to confront and acknowledge one's inner demons. Just like the worms bring fertility to the soil, so do suffering and inner struggle bring beauty and growth to the soul. Additionally, I think there is an odd similarity between June's depiction of the worm, sometimes referred as the serpent, and the monster's faces. What do you think? Make sure to leave a comment with your thoughts. Now, what is probably next for Boyd? Boyd is a soldier, a pragmatic, no-nonsense type of guy. Yet, we've seen him become more intuitive with each episode, realizing that his traditional logical and practical approach to solving problems doesn't quite work in the town. Boyd has begun to realize that he must open himself up to the unknown, to the magical, and in so doing, he's getting closer to better understanding himself and the rules of the game, something Jim might eventually have to recognize for himself. Other characters like Jade and Tabitha are also beginning to make similar progress. We can even see how others begin to wonder whether Boyd is actually losing his mind. And these might all just be symptoms of the deep psychological transformation and growth he's undergoing. This is probably one of the most epic quotes from Jung. "Those laboring in the darkness must try to accomplish an opus that will cause the fish's eyes to shine in the depths of the sea. Everything that the darkness thinks, grasps, and comprehends by itself is dark. Therefore, it is only illuminated by what to it is unexpected, unwanted, and incomprehensible." The imagery of the fish's eyes being illuminated by a source of light in the depths of the dark sea is very powerful. In the case of Boyd, he is currently laboring in the darkness because he is seeking insights into the nature of the town by being open to the mystical and unknown, the eerie, unlike Jim, who relies solely on his logical reasoning and science. For Jung, you need something beyond rationality to illuminate or confront the shadow, something equivalent to the shadow in origin, such as visions, active imagination, symbolic rituals, and one of the most powerful instruments, faith, for it is deeply rooted in the unconscious as a source of meaning. That is what overcomes the darkness. And for the shadow, this type of archetypal or symbolic confrontation is unexpected and unwanted, as this is its language and its weakness. As we've discussed previously, symbols are the language of the unconscious, which is why dreams can be really hard to comprehend sometimes. When we choose this symbolic or archetypal engagement with the shadow, we shine a light on it and understand it better. The shadow then loses its power or influence over the individual, and the individual in turn becomes more empowered and more whole. The key to survival in the town might actually be to get in touch with these symbols of the unconscious, to get in touch with this primordial language of the mind. In the words of the famous British singer Seal,
But we're never gonna survive unless we get a little crazy.
Trials and Tribulations. One of my suspicions about the scene with Martin is that it might have been a test for Boyd. One of the things that struck me was how Martin highlights Boyd's kindness, a key virtue, which he hadn't seen in a long time, and Boyd's refusal to just kill him, but instead try to save him. A pattern of behavior that is also seen in Boyd's treatment of Sara, and the kindness that Elgin showed to Sara despite the horrible things she did. In this sense, I don't think Martin passed the worms to Boyd just to rid himself of suffering, but a different purpose in response to Boyd's virtuous behavior. Maybe because not everybody is capable of hosting the worms. Here's another biblical reference that I think will be good food for thought. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. Last but not least, we need to talk about Sara. Whatever is influencing Sara is undeniably dark, and like Kenny said, is using Sara as a pawn for some purpose. We know that there are two factions in the show, which appear to be light and darkness, just like it was in Lost. However, in the case of From, these factions seem to draw more upon from the psychological concepts of the shadow and consciousness, chaos versus order. We can see Boyd is trying to save Sara, and that there could be a redemption path for her, but quite clearly, one does not simply come back from doing the things Sara did, monstrous things. It will ultimately be up to her to push back against whatever forces are trying to influence her. Something we learned from Lost is that there is always a choice, regardless of the circumstances, and Sara chose to make the bad ones, both willingly and selfishly. In previous videos, we've explored how, if the shadow is not confronted and addressed, it will manifest in the form of destructive, harmful, and even monstrous behaviors, exerting a negative influence over the individual. Now, once again, the shadow is not inherently evil, but the potential for both good and evil lies within it. In our first Jungian analysis, we even explored how substance abuse and impulsive behaviors can be some of the self-destructive manifestations of an unconfronted shadow. In cases like this, we can say that the individual becomes possessed by their shadow, or that unconscious part of themselves. With all this said, I suspect that there is something very dark growing in Sara. One of the scenes that caught my attention is when Sara passes in front of Ethan's house after Ethan confronts her and accuses her of being a monster. And for a brief second, she smiles at Ethan in an uncanny way that resembles the way the monsters smile, as if there was something sinister lurking just behind her face. And I wonder if this was deliberately planned by the producers as foreshadowing of what will happen to Sara, which also makes one wonder whether Sara's process will shine a light on the nature of the monsters and where they come from. In episode 5, Victor also explained to Jade how the symbol he sees negatively influenced the man in the picture, Christopher, the original owner of the diary Jade found with the symbols on. Victor also implied that bad things started happening after Christopher started seeing the symbol, which I suspect is somehow connected with what is happening to Sara, and how the darkness influences people to do bad things or make moves on his behalf like pawns. This concludes the first part of the mid-season analysis for the second season of From. I only covered some of the main highlights in this video. What are your thoughts about these interpretations? If you're new to the channel and would like to see more content, please make sure to hit the notification bell, subscribe to the channel, and hit the like button. Till next time.